The night was bitterly cold, the kind that settled deep into your bones and refused to let go. A relentless wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the promise of an unforgiving storm. Snowflakes tumbled from the sky in thick, chaotic swirls, coating the ground in a frozen, unyielding layer of white. In the darkness, a lone figure trudged forward. Her fur, once thick and majestic, was matted with ice and dirt. Her ribs pressed against her skin, her body weakened by hunger and exhaustion. But she did not stop, because she was not alone. The German shepherd let out a soft whimper and turned her head. Behind her, nestled in the shelter of a cold, abandoned alley, were 4 tiny bundles of fur. Her puppies, helpless, trembling, their small bodies curled together in a desperate attempt to stay warm. She had tried to keep them safe, to find food, shelter, anything. But the streets had been cruel. Doors had been slammed in her face. People had shooed her away, too busy or too afraid to help a stray dog and her newborns. Now, with the storm closing in, she was running out of time. She nudged her puppies gently, urging them forward. They whimpered, their tiny paws sinking into the snow as they followed their mother. And then, just as the last of her strength threatened to give out, she saw it. A house. The yard was surrounded by a fence, but the gate had been left slightly open. The porch light flickered, illuminating the warm glow of a home untouched by the storm's cruelty. She didn't hesitate. With the last of her energy, she guided her puppies through the gate, pressing them into the corner of the yard where the wind couldn't reach. The snow-covered grass felt softer than the frozen pavement she had known for weeks. She curled around them, shielding their tiny bodies with her own. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to close her eyes. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was hope. What she didn't know was that the person inside that house was about to change everything. The first light of morning crept through the frost-covered window, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Inside the house, Ben Carter rubbed his hands together for warmth as he shuffled into the kitchen. The old heater struggled against the brutal winter cold, and he sighed, mentally adding get the furnace checked to his ever-growing to-do list. He had lived alone for years, ever since his wife passed. His days followed a quiet, predictable rhythm: coffee, morning paper, work in the garage, and the occasional call from his daughter, Sarah, who always reminded him he should get a dog for company. Too much responsibility, he would tell her. I wouldn't even know where to start. He had no idea that fate was about to make that decision for him. As he reached for his coffee pot, something outside the window caught his eye. A strange, dark shape huddled in the far corner of his yard. He squinted, pressing a hand to the cold glass. At first, it looked like a pile of snow-covered rags. But then it moved. A dog. No, not just a dog, a mother dog. And she wasn't alone. Ben's breath hitched as he noticed the tiny shapes pressed against her belly. Puppies. Their fur was damp from the snow, their tiny bodies curled together in an effort to stay warm. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the door. The cold was sharp and unforgiving as Ben stepped onto the porch. His boots crunched against the snow, but the dog didn't stir. She was completely still. Too still. A sick feeling twisted in his stomach as he moved closer. "Hey girl," he called gently. "You okay?" Nothing. For a horrifying moment, he thought she was gone, that she had given everything she had to protect her babies and hadn't survived the night. But then her ear twitched. Relief flooded him. "Hey girl," he tried again, softer this time. "It's okay. You're safe." The dog slowly lifted her head. Her deep brown eyes were filled with exhaustion, but there was something else in them too. Worry. Not for herself. For them. Her gaze flickered to the puppies nestled beneath her, barely moving, their tiny bodies shivering. She had survived the night, but if they stayed out here any longer, they wouldn't. Ben couldn't let that happen. Moving carefully, he pulled off his scarf and extended it toward her. "Come on, sweetheart. Let me help." The mother dog tensed. She didn't trust him. Ben understood. He was a stranger, and for who knew how long, the world had been cruel to her. But there was no more time. "I won't hurt them," he promised. "I swear." She stared at him, unblinking, untrusting. Then, the smallest movement, She shifted, exposing her puppies just slightly. She was giving him a chance. Ben wasted no time. He scooped up the first puppy, then another. They were so light, their little ribs pressing against his fingers. He tucked them inside his coat, feeling their fragile warmth against his chest. The mother whimpered as he reached for the last two, but she didn't stop him. She was too weak to move. Ben's throat tightened. He had to get her inside, too. The moment they stepped inside, warmth engulfed them. The puppies let out tiny whimpers as the heat touched their frostbitten fur. Ben gently placed them on a thick towel near the fireplace before turning back to their mother. She stood just inside the doorway, hesitant. The contrast between the warmth of the home and the bitter cold outside was stark. For months, maybe longer, she had known only fear and survival. Now, she stood at the threshold of something different. Ben knelt down, holding out his hand. "It's okay, girl," he whispered. "Come on in." She hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she took a slow, shaky step forward, and another, until she collapsed beside her puppies, exhaustion finally winning. Ben moved quickly, wrapping her in a thick blanket. He didn't know much about dogs, but he knew enough to recognize she was on the edge of total exhaustion. She had pushed herself past every limit to keep her babies alive. Now, she needed help. He grabbed his phone and dialed the only number he could think of. "Sarah," he said the second his daughter picked up. "I need a vet. Now." The next few hours were a blur. Sarah arrived within the hour, a veterinarian friend in tow. The house became a makeshift emergency clinic, filled with the sounds of rushed voices and worried glances. The puppies were dehydrated but stable. Their mother, though, she was critical. "She's malnourished," the vet said, checking her pulse. "She's been feeding them, but she hasn't eaten in days. Maybe longer." Ben's chest tightened. He had never felt anger toward a stranger before, but the thought of someone abandoning this brave, loyal mother made his blood boil. "She needs fluids," the vet continued. "Food. Rest. If we give her that, she has a chance." Ben nodded firmly. "Do whatever it takes." The next 24 hours were a waiting game. Ben stayed by her side, spoon-feeding her broth, keeping the fire warm. The puppies grew stronger, their tiny tails wagging as they nursed, unaware of the battle their mother was fighting. And then, the next morning, as Ben knelt beside her, her eyes opened fully. Not just barely, not just the tired, pained flicker of before. Clear, awake, alive. She let out a soft whimper, lifting her head. Ben couldn't help it. He laughed. A genuine, relieved, tear-filled laugh. "You scare me, girl." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, weakly, she licked his hand. A silent thank you. Ben swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're safe now." And for the first time in her life, she believed him. The house had been quiet for days, peaceful, warm, a stark contrast to the frigid streets where the German Shepherd had fought to survive. Her puppies had gained strength, their tiny bodies now warm and full after endless days of hunger. They wriggled and nursed eagerly, unaware of the silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. Ben Carter had never been a man of mystery, nor had he ever expected one to land on his doorstep. But something about this dog, this mother, was different, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. On the third morning, Ben sat on the floor beside the mother dog, watching as she sniffed curiously at her surroundings. She was still weak, but there was a growing sharpness in her eyes, a flicker of intelligence beyond instinct. "You need a name," he murmured. Sarah, who had been sitting nearby, spoke up. "She kind of reminds me of a warrior." Ben chuckled. Yeah. The way she fought to protect those puppies, that's not just survival. That's determination." He looked down at the German Shepherd, still unsure if she fully trusted him yet. She was watching him, really watching him, as if she understood every word. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "All right, girl. How about Sasha?" For the first time since she had entered the house, the dog's ears perked. Not a little. Fully. Sarah's eyebrows lifted. "Dad, I think she knows that name." Ben frowned. That didn't make sense. He had just made it up, hadn't he? He tried again. "Sasha." The dog stood up, not hesitantly, not shakily. Immediately, Ben and Sarah exchanged looks. That's not a coincidence, Sarah murmured. Over the next few days, Sasha continued to regain her strength, but so did the mystery surrounding her. Ben started noticing things, unusual things. For a dog that had supposedly been living on the streets, she was incredibly well-trained. She never barked unnecessarily. She sat when told. She even waited at doorways, as if expecting permission before entering. Then, there was the way she watched Ben. Not like a stray desperate for food or shelter. More like she was trying to remember him, or rather, trying to remember something. One evening, as Ben sat by the fire, Sasha stood at attention, staring at the front door. Not at the door itself, at the handle. Before Ben could react, she rose on her hind legs, pressed her nose against the lever, and pushed it down. The door swung open. Ben blinked in shock. "Did you see that?" Sarah, who had been cradling one of the puppies, gasped. "Dad, that's not just any stray. That's a trained dog." Ben's mind reeled. Not just trained. She knows how to open doors. Sarah hesitated. What if she had a family? The words hit hard. What if she did? And worse, what if someone out there was looking for her? Determined to find answers, Sarah called her veterinarian friend to check Sasha for a microchip. The results? She had one. Ben's heart pounded as Sarah held up her phone. "Okay, I'm running the number through the database." The room was silent as they waited. Sasha sat by Ben's feet, her head resting on his knee. He absent-mindedly scratched behind her ears, but his thoughts were racing. If she had a microchip, that meant she had an owner. And if she had an owner, his stomach twisted. Would he have to give her up? Then, Sarah's face paled. "What?" Ben asked. She swallowed hard. "Dad, this says she belonged to someone." "Okay," he said carefully. "Who?" Sarah hesitated before turning the phone to face him. Ben's blood ran cold. The name on the registration wasn't just any name. It was Sergeant Daniel Carter, his son. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He took the phone with trembling fingers, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Daniel, his son, the boy he had raised, the boy who had grown into a soldier, who had left for a mission overseas and never come back. It had been 3 years since the military had knocked on his door, their solemn faces delivering the news he had never wanted to hear. His son was gone, or at least, that's what they had told him. And yet, here was his dog, alive, standing beside him. Ben turned to Sasha, his heart hammering. You were his." Sasha whined softly, her ears flattening as if she understood the weight of his words. She had known him all along. Ben's throat tightened. Where have you been?" Sarah was already searching for answers. According to this, she was registered to Daniel's base in North Carolina. But when she hesitated. When he didn't come home, she must have been, I don't know, given away, lost. Ben's chest ached. But how did she end up here? Sarah shook her head. That's what doesn't make sense. If she was in North Carolina, that's states away. There's no way she just wandered here on her own. Ben turned back to Sasha. Had she been searching? Had she somehow found her way back? His hands shook as he ran them through her fur. "I should have known. I should have recognized you." She let out a soft whimper and pressed her forehead against his chest. And for the first time in 3 years, Ben let himself cry. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was his son, Daniel, playing in the yard as a kid. Daniel, excitedly introducing him to the puppy he had just adopted. Daniel, boarding that plane for his final mission. He had thought that part of his life was gone forever. But Sasha had found her way back. And if she had survived, his heart pounded. Had they been wrong about Daniel? Had his son somehow survived too? And if so, where was he now? Ben had always believed that some things were beyond explanation. But one thing was certain. Sasha had not come here by accident. She had led him to something. And whatever it was, the truth was waiting to be found. Ben sat in the dim glow of his living room, Sasha curled up at his feet. The puppies slept soundly by the fireplace, their tiny bodies rising and falling in steady rhythms. The house was silent, but inside Ben's mind, there was a storm raging, a storm of memories, questions, and impossible hope. For 3 years, he had mourned his son, believing Daniel was gone forever. And yet, here was his dog, somehow, finding her way back to him. It wasn't just chance. It couldn't be. Something inside Ben whispered that Sasha knew something, something no one else did, and he was determined to find out what. Sarah had spent the last few days reaching out to contacts, trying to piece together what had happened to Sasha after Daniel's supposed death. That night, she rushed into the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Dad," she gasped. "I think I found something." Ben sat up straight. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. Sasha wasn't abandoned. She was sent away. Ben's stomach dropped. Sent away? Sarah nodded. After Daniel's unit reported him as Kia, his personal belongings were given to the military's recovery division. Sasha was registered as a service dog, but for some reason, she wasn't reassigned to another soldier. Ben's heart pounded. Why? Sarah hesitated. Because someone flagged her file as classified. The word sent a chill down Ben's spine. What the hell does that mean? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But it means that someone, somewhere, didn't want anyone to find out what happened to her. Ben stared down at Sasha, who was watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. What had she seen? And more importantly, what had she been trying to tell him all along? Sasha had always been smart. Too smart. But that night, something shifted. As Ben sat on the floor beside her, Sasha suddenly stood up, ears pricked. Then, she walked toward the door and whined. Ben frowned. What is it, girl? She let out another soft whimper, then turned and nudged his coat. Ben's breath caught. He reached for the coat, confused. What are you trying to show me? Sasha pawed at the pocket. His hands shook as he reached inside, expecting to feel nothing. Instead, his fingers brushed against paper. His pulse spiked. He pulled it out. It was a photo. His son. A military ID photo, slightly crumpled, but unmistakable. Ben's breath hitched. Where did you? Then he froze, because on the back of the photo, in faded handwriting, were two words that made his heart stop. I'm alive. The room spun. Ben's hands shook violently as he stared at the words, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. This was impossible. Daniel was dead. The military had told him. The funeral had been held. The flag had been folded and handed to him. So how could this be real? Sarah gasped. Dad, this handwriting. It looks like... Ben's voice was hoarse. Daniel's. Silence. Sasha whined again, nudging his knee, as if begging him to understand. Then it hit him. Sasha had been trying to lead him to this all along. She had found a way back to him, carrying a message from his son, one that had been overlooked, ignored, buried in the chaos of war. Ben's hands tightened into fists. If Daniel had written this, it meant one thing. The military had lied. Ben stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood. We need to go. Sarah's eyes widened. Go where? To the last place Daniel was seen. Sarah hesitated. Dad, that was overseas. I don't care. His voice was raw, filled with desperation, fury, and hope. If Daniel had been alive after the report of his death, if he had written that message and somehow sent Sasha back, then that meant he was still out there, and Ben was going to find him. Sasha barked, as if in agreement. She wasn't done leading him yet. Sarah made frantic calls to her contacts in the military, pushing past bureaucratic walls, demanding answers. And then, by some miracle, they got one. A lead. A soldier, stationed in a classified location, had once served with Daniel. He wasn't allowed to talk. But when Sarah pressed, he broke protocol and said just 3 words before hanging up. He's still waiting. Ben's knees nearly buckled. Waiting. His son was waiting. For what? For rescue? For someone to find him? Sasha let out a deep, knowing sound. A sound that wasn't just a bark, but a plea. She had made it back to Ben. Now, it was time to bring Daniel home. And nothing in the world was going to stop them. The plane touched down in the early hours of the morning. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the distant hum of a foreign city vibrated through the ground beneath them. Ben had barely slept. His mind was racing, his heart pounding with anticipation, fear, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. Sarah walked beside him, her fingers clenched around her phone, waiting for the next call, the next clue, anything that would bring them closer to Daniel. And at Ben's side, as steady as ever, was Sasha. She had led him here, and somehow, he knew, she would lead him to his son. Days turned into a blur of searching, following scattered pieces of a puzzle that had long been buried. Every step brought new obstacles. Military red tape, conflicting reports, people who looked at Ben like he was crazy. "Your son is dead, Mr. Carter. Accept it." But Ben didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Because Sasha had proven otherwise. And then, on the fourth day, everything changed. A small, makeshift village, hidden in the outskirts of a war-torn region. And a man, unshaven, gaunt, with haunted eyes, stepped out of a dimly lit shelter. Ben's breath hitched. The man stopped. His body tensed, then stilled. Ben felt his heart stop. And then, "Dad!" The world spun. Ben's breath left his body in a broken sob. He took a step forward, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. "Daniel." His voice cracked, raw and disbelieving. And then Sasha moved. She surged forward, bounding across the dirt, her powerful legs carrying her faster than Ben had ever seen her run. Daniel barely had time to react before she leaped into him, her body colliding against his chest, knocking him back a step. The sound she made, a whimper, a cry, a desperate, broken song of reunion, shattered whatever restraint was left inside Ben. Daniel fell to his knees, his arms wrapping around Sasha as she frantically licked his face, her tail wagging wildly, her body trembling with overwhelming emotion. Ben collapsed beside them, his arms locked around his son, clutching him as if he'd disappear if he let go. Daniel was here, alive, and Sasha had brought him home. The truth unraveled in pieces. Daniel had been left behind, not killed, but abandoned, assumed dead in the chaos of war. He had been taken in by locals, surviving against the odds, waiting, hoping that one day someone would come for him. But no one had, until Sasha. Somehow, she had escaped, traveled miles, crossed borders, survived the impossible, all to find Ben. She had carried Daniel's last message, and she had never stopped searching, even when the world had given up, even when time had buried the truth. Sasha had known, and she had saved him. The flight home was different. Daniel sat beside Ben, his body thinner, his face older, but his eyes still the same. And at his feet, curled up in peaceful exhaustion, was Sasha. She had done her job. She had completed her mission. And now, as the sun rose beyond the clouds, Ben realized something. There are some bonds that defy logic, that go beyond what we can explain. Some love is simply meant to endure. Sasha hadn't just been a dog. She had been a protector, a guide, a force greater than fate itself. And because of her, a father had his son again, and a soldier had finally made a home. This story isn't just about survival. It's about faith, about never letting go, even when the world tells you to. It's about the kind of love that refuses to be forgotten. And in the end, it's about a dog who proved that sometimes the greatest rescues aren't done by humans at all.